So with Justice Brett Kavanaugh about to hear his first case on the Supreme Court, let's take a look back at his record, what we know about it, where he might stand on some key issues that'll come before the court. On abortion, he has had only one major ruling in his time on the federal bench. It was in 2017, the D.C. Appeals Court ruling in favor of an undocumented 17-year-old seeking an abortion while being held by immigration authorities. Kavanaugh dissented, accusing his fellow judges of creating, quote, a new right for unlawful immigrant minors in U.S. government's attention to obtain immediate abortion on demand. As for his opinion on Roe v. Wade, Kavanaugh told the Judiciary Committee the landmark decision was, quote, settled as precedent of the Supreme Court that has been reaffirmed many times. When it comes to LGBT rights, Kavanaugh has no judicial record. During his confirmation hearing, he wouldn't say whether he believes Obergefell versus Hodges, which legalized same-sex marriage, was rightfully decided. He would only refer to the tradition of nominees not giving opinions on hypotheticals, saying, quote, they've all declined when asked to answer that question. However, in remarks at George Mason University, in 2016, he spoke positively about Justice Antonin Scalia's dissent in that case, arguing, quote, for Justice Scalia, it was not the court's job to improve on or update the Constitution to create new rights. On gun rights, Kavanaugh believes in the right to bear arms. In 2011, the majority of his colleagues on the appellate court upheld D.C.'s ban on possessing semi-automatic rifles. But he wrote a 52-page dissent, arguing the ban was unconstitutional because the weapons, quote, have not traditionally been banned and are in common use by law-abiding citizens for self-defense in the home, hunting, and other lawful uses. He defended his opinion during his confirmation hearing, saying, quote, my job was to follow the Second Amendment opinion of the Supreme Court, whether I agree with it or disagree with it. And finally, one issue that's considered most important to President Trump, the question of executive power. Kavanaugh writing an article in 2009 arguing that, quote, we should not burden a sitting president with civil suits, criminal investigations, or criminal prosecutions, though he added that it would take an act of Congress to provide that kind of immunity. During his confirmation hearings, Kavanaugh argued his writings were, quote, ideas for Congress to consider. They were not my constitutional views. The whole confirmation process has been an emotionally fraught whirlwind. Let's take a look now back at how it played out in the days leading up to this weekend's final vote.
There is a sense among some Republican leaders that a delay of Kavanaugh's vote is essentially a death sentence.
How did you get home? I don't remember. How'd you get there? I don't remember. How many years ago was it? I don't know.
3 of the 4 key senators voting to end debate and proceed to a final vote.
I could not conclude that he is the right person for the court.
I will vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh.
The nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh of Maryland to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
Senator, do you think that there's still a place in the Democratic Party for you after this?
He's just an extraordinary person, a great talent, and I think he's going to make us all very proud.
And joining me now, Jennifer Rubin, opinion writer for The Washington Post, and Josh Barro, business columnist for New York Magazine. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Jennifer, let me start with you first. Just thinking back here, over the last week or two, when you had that testimony in front of the Judiciary Committee from Christine Blasey Ford, I think in that window between her testimony and when the world heard from Brett Kavanaugh, I think if there was conventional wisdom that formed in that moment, it was that his nomination might actually be finished. What was key when you look at it now? What was key to him actually being able to get confirmed? What happened? What was he able to tap into? What were Republicans were able to tap into here?
I think Republicans have rerun their methodology from 2016 to rely on white male anger and resentment. And that's what they did. And they made it virtually impossible for any Republican to call himself or herself a Republican without joining in that. But I actually think now that he's on the court, we have a different problem, much more serious, and that is the question of the court's legitimacy. I think his rant, his partisan rant accusing unnamed Democrats of being out to get him, and his threat, which was what goes around comes around, now poses a big problem for the court and for him specifically. And we heard just last week Elena Kagan speak that she is concerned, on the court she is concerned, that now the United States Supreme Court, which was the jewel of our legal system, is viewed as simply skins and shirts, red and blue, that it lacks legal legitimacy. And that's a problem for Congress, for the courts, for all of us.
Yeah, Josh, I'm curious what you think of that, because obviously there was some concern about this even among potential Kavanaugh votes in the Senate. So the supporters in the Senate, it's why he put that Wall Street Journal op-ed out the night before his vote. I'm thinking back to, after the 2000 election when the court decided the Bush-Gore election, there were all the questions raised back then. Is it now just going to be seen as a partisan institution? The threat Jennifer is describing there, how real do you think that is right now?
I think it's real, but I think the responsibility to resolve it rests mostly with Chief Justice John Roberts rather than with Kavanaugh. Roberts is going to be the new ideological middle of the court. Obviously, that means the court has shifted to the right compared to when that was Anthony Kennedy. But Roberts has a record. He's a conservative, but he's also very concerned about the public sense of legitimacy for the court. And he's a little bit more modest in terms of his view of how the court should operate than some of the other conservative judges. He's more inclined toward recognizing precedent. There's actually a decision, it's not the most hot-button case, there was a decision about sales tax this year, Wayfair versus South Dakota, where Roberts wrote this dissent saying the decision they were looking at 25 years ago, it was a wrong decision, he says, but it's been standing for so long, Congress could have changed it. Instead of the court coming in and changing this policy, we should stand back and say, let Congress change this if they don't like the previous precedent. I think that might set a roadmap for some hot-button issues that will come before Roberts, where he'll face a choice about should he join with his other conservative colleagues and overturn a long-standing precedent, or should he look for a more modest road and say that we're going to defer to the legislative branch on some of these things. So I think that he will view that as a key task for him. I think Kavanaugh has made his job harder because Kavanaugh has primed Democrats to even more think that conservative decisions by this court are purely political. So I think that's a difficult road for Roberts to walk, but I think it's going to be on him to preserve that sense that the court is at least one or two steps removed from politics. Kavanaugh is basically going to be just another conservative vote on the court, is my expectation. He's going to be a key vote for those conservative decisions, but it's ultimately going to be up to Roberts whether they have that 5-vote majority.
And Jennifer, just in terms of the cultural division in this country, I mean, this was just based on the polling. This was the most polarizing Supreme Court nomination fight since Robert Bork, 30 plus years ago. Bork didn't get confirmed. Kavanaugh ends up confirmed. But we've talked a lot about certainly the opposition to the nomination, the women's movement we've seen against Donald Trump in the last year or two, how those two things sort of synced up. And you've got that question of, a female-driven movement that's already been there against Trump. Is that going to be accelerated by this? I was curious, though, too, to hear some Republicans saying some sort of they were saying from some traditionally Republican female voters, like in suburban areas of this country, who looked at this and said, they looked at it from the Kavanaugh perspective and said, if it were my son, if it were my husband who were accused of something and they said they didn't do it, and they found some sympathy there. It just seems like there's just vast cultural divide here in how people viewed this.
I think that's hooey. If you look at any polling data, first of all, it was very negative towards Kavanaugh, very negative among women, even more negative among suburban women. So I think that's wishful thinking on behalf of the Republicans. But I want to go back to what Josh was saying. It's not just the Supreme Court justice, and I've written that column that he sort of outlined right there many a time. It is up to each one of the justices. It's up to, I think, Kavanaugh to frankly recuse himself on some key cases. I think it's up to all the justices to lower the tone. The tone of their opinions has become combative, even personally nasty. I think it behooves the justices to avoid going to clearly ideological groups and kind of cheering their side on. I think they should stop commenting on politics. In this regard, Ruth Bader Ginsburg bears a responsibility. It has to be a joint effort, because I think the court is at a point in time where people will not take it seriously, and we will have states and individuals testing it. As Justice Kagan said last week, we don't have an army. We can't make people live up to our opinions, and we will have some legal chaos if this goes on. So it's not just Roberts, it's all 9 of them now. And you know what? If they don't do that, the next time Democrats get in power, we're going to have a court packing scheme. Well, that's where we're headed for if they don't pull back on this rabid partisanship.
That's the other question, Josh, is does this linger in our politics in the sense of you've had Democrats out there, some talking about the idea of investigating Kavanaugh if they get some congressional power, the possibility of impeaching him, the possibility, as Jennifer says, of saying, hey, there's broader reforms, changes to the system here. Do you see Democrats taking this fight and looking for specific changes to the way the judiciary is organized, specifically going after Kavanaugh at all? Do you see it playing out that way?
I mean, I think there's going to be a push to impeach Judge Kavanaugh, but you would need a 2/3 vote in the Senate to remove him. So if there was a push, it wouldn't lead to his removal from the court. It would only be a political exercise. The more substantive question, I think, is whether Democrats, when they next control the Senate and the presidency at the same time, will seek to add seats to the court in order to solidify a liberal majority on the court. And I think certainly the way this nomination played out makes that more likely. But I think the key thing that will determine that will be the decisions that come down from this court. I take Jennifer's point that that it would be good for judges to project less of a political image. I have also not been a fan of the way that Ginsburg and some of the other judges have been more directly involved in politics over the last few years. But I think the main thing that drives that perception of public legitimacy or illegitimacy is key rulings that the court makes. And so, for example, when they face test cases around Roe versus Wade, people talk about this idea like, will the court uphold or overturn Roe versus Wade? A full overturning of Roe versus Wade, I think, would fully outrage the entire left and make it extremely likely that they would try court packing when they could. I think a more likely outcome, though, is something in the middle, something that weakens Roe versus Wade without overturning it. And I think that's going to be key on Roberts' mind, sort of how far can they go while maintaining enough political legitimacy so that they don't face court packing.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.